As you can see by the title of this video, I will be analyzing every serial killer that was active in the United States from the late 1700s until 2023. Now, if you look it up on Wikipedia, there are hundreds, so let me just make a little rule. They have to have at least killed more than 2 people, so that gets about 100 out. I suggest you watch this video while relaxing, or working out, or even sleeping. I would also like to preface this by saying this video was going to be every single one in its entirety, but this would have been an 8-hour long video. So I'm going to break it down into a part 1 and part 2. So instead of me spending 6 months on a video, I can spend 3 months on a video at one time and then 3 months on another video. Final thing. These earlier serial killers were a little harder to document, so some details are going to be hard to find. But stick around, and I promise you'll find out that these earlier serial killers were pretty brutal. Alright, so let's turn down the lights, get some food, and let's get right into the video. The Harpe Brothers. The Harpe Brothers were 2 cousins. Yeah, I don't know why they were called brothers, who are believed to have been born in Orange County, North Carolina. They were named Micah and William. Sometime during 1797, the Harpes began a vicious crime spree through Texas, Kentucky, and Illinois. So they just went crazy and started killing people. The Harpes then returned to eastern Tennessee, where they continued their vicious murder spree. As the 2 fled west to avoid a new posse, organized by John Lapeer, which included an avenging husband from a previous murder, and a father, Moses DeGaulle. While the 2 men were about to kill somebody else, they got ran up on by the posse. They asked them to surrender, but instead they ran. Micah was shot in the leg and cut by a tomahawk. As he lay dying, he had confessed to over 20 murders, and the gang leader began slowly chopping his head off. The other brother William got lucky and was able to escape. However, 4 years later, him and the rest of the gang was caught. Records are shaky because he went under a different name, but once he was eventually caught, he was sentenced to being hung. Paddy Cannon. Paddy Cannon was an illegal slave trader and murderer in the mid to late 1700s. From what I gathered, she was part of a gang, though she mainly was the one who did all the crimes, and had a big hand in the slave trade. In 1829, Cannon was the only member of the gang captured and indicted in Delaware for 4 murders. After the remains of 4 black people, including 3 children, were discovered on property she owned. Though she had nearly confessed to 24 more, Cannon died in her cell in Georgetown on May 11, 1829, at an age estimated between 60 and 70. Some say she committed suicide, but that's not yet to be proven. Edward Rulloff. Rulloff was born near Brunswick to Danish parents. He had a brother, and everything was pretty normal for the guy. He grew up, had a wife and kid, though he lived close to his in-laws. He told his wife that he wanted to be further away. When she said no, he beat her to death across the head, and then poisoned the child they had. He attempted to commit suicide, but he was unable to. He went to his neighbors to borrow a horse and to go out of town for a little while and lay low. He ended up returning, and the townspeople had spreaded the rumor that he had killed his wife. He had denied it and said that his wife had left him, though everyone called BS and threw him in jail. He was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years. After he was released, he then planned a burglary that went wrong, and then he shot a person in the head to escape. He was then hung in 1871. Andreas Hall. Andreas Hall was born in New York in 1824. Little is known of his early life. In 1847, Hall was traveling with another young man, Franklin Brown, when the pair got into some sort of quarrel near Troy. In a fit of anger, Hall killed him and then stole all of his valuables. He had poorly hidden his body and never came back to it. Years later, however, he wanted to rob an old couple who he had done some work for in the past. He knew they had money inside their house and he could rob them, so he led the old man down into the grasslands and plunged a spike through his head. He then went back to the house and axed up the poor old lady. The next day, the neighbors went inside the home of the old couple and reported it to authorities. He was found with an unnamed peddler, and they were arrested on charge of killing the old couple. Hall pleaded innocent, though just days before his execution, he confessed to both crimes and a couple others that weren't included in the murders. He was hung on March 15, 1849. Boone Helms. Boone was born in Kentucky into what was considered an honest, hard-working, and respected family. He and his family ended up moving to Missouri, where he showed great feats of strength, especially in horseback riding. Years later, in 1851, he married a woman named Lucinda, and they had a daughter. Though they grew up really poor, they decided to move to California in search for gold. Helm asked his cousin Litterbury Shute to accompany him on the search, though Shute agreed. When he wanted to back out, an angered Helm stabbed him in the chest and headed out by himself. He was later captured by Shute's brother and family, though when he was captured, he acted crazy as he was held captive. So he was taken to a mental asylum where he would convince one of the guards to take him out for walks. Once the walks became routine, he made his escape. On his way back to California to find some gold, he murdered several men in altercations in which he admitted at one point he even ate his victims he came across, which to be known the first known cannibal. Once he was in San Francisco, he killed a rancher who he had befriended and led him inside his farm. He then traveled to Oregon for some reason to rob people who he would also kill. He teamed up with other gang leaders and found himself arrested and found guilty with other individuals. In a crowd of 6,000 people, he jumped off Hangman's box before the box below him was kicked. Isacc Wood. Isaac was born in New Jersey. Not much is known about his early life, though at one point he moved to New York where he lived with his brother. He lived there for many years until, unfortunately, in 1855, while his brother's wife was out of town, Isaac poisoned his brother, who died a few days later. Though it perplexed doctors, his wife immediately returned home, which her and her two kids were again poisoned by Isaac. Though she died, the kids survived. Isaac received his brother's estates and were the kids' parental guardian. The only reason he was suspected, however, was because he wrote a fake check for $2,500 in his brother's name. Authorities dug up David and his wife and found a lot of traces of arsenic, suspecting that Isaac had poisoned them. He was on the hunt by authorities. Now, I know you're asking, who was the third person he killed? Well, his wife. He poisoned the exact same way a few months prior and just hadn't told anybody. Yeah, he had a completely different wife before, this whole family. He was tried and he reached a very easy guilty verdict. And at his hanging, 60 people were there, 2 of them being the kids he tried to poison but didn't kill. Felipe Espinosa. Now, Felipe was born in New Mexico, and just like the last few, his early life isn't really well known. But what is known is that his family was nuts, especially him and his brother, Vivian. The two ended up in the Americas because that one treaty was just signed which allowed Hispanic settlers to come to the United States. Aided by his brother Vivian, Espinosa began his murder spree in the thinly populated area of what is now known as Vermont County, Colorado. The brother's first victim was found in May 1863, his corpse mutilated, and the heart hacked out of his chest. During that summer, 25 more people were attacked and killed in a similar fashion. Espinosa really messed up when he sent a territorial governor threatening demands to give him land or he will kill 600 more people, including him. Those are some big boy numbers. Lawmen were sent out to find Espinosa. Though they were met with little success, the closest they got was finding his brother Vivian and killing him, though Felipe escaped. He then got by Tom Tobin, who apparently was like a legendary tracker, and he cut off his head and brought it back to Lydia Sherman. Yeah, for some reason, there is very little known about this woman. All of what I could find is that she was orphaned and raised by her uncle, and at the age of 16, she was married to her husband, Edward, which they moved to New York City, in which they had 7 total children. After Edward became depressed after losing work, she poisoned him with arsenic. Oh wow, her and the other guy must have known each other. He died, and 6 weeks later, she poisoned 3 of her children in the same way, and 2 more children in 1865. All of their death certificates were listed as typhoid fever. When she was tried and caught, 5 years into her sentence, she escaped due to the pretext of being sick, and she got a job as a housekeeper and married some other dude. Why would he do that? He had some health problems, so Lydia decided to poison him, which killed him. She was caught and thrown back in jail, and that's where she died from a form of cancer. Thomas Williamson. Thomas was born in Illinois in 1831. At the age of 13, he attempted to rob a store. After being caught, he was sent to a local penitentiary. At the age of 22, he was struck with an illness that made him paralyzed on one side down. He was later jailed for horse stealing, which he spent a week. That was petty crime, so I'm gonna move to the kinda good stuff. Apparently, at one point, he and his brother-in-law would go play poker with some old man, and at one point, an altercation arose, and Thomas killed the old man. He and his brother-in-law dipped, and they got captured at one point, though he avoided police at the time, but he was caught later. So, at the place where he was gonna be hanged, his attorney, 1800 Saul Goodman, got his sentence changed, where he had to spend 11 years in prison. After he got out though, he got married, and this is where things get a little shaky. It's unsure if he killed his wife, but she just went missing one day, and somebody asked about it, and he said that she went to go visit a family, and that's it. He sought out work around the time and came across a farmhouse where he worked as a farmhand. The 2 who owned the farm were murdered by Thomas, and he was later caught by authorities. He was of course tried, then of course hung. The Bender family. The Bender family was a family of serial killers who were in Kansas. They consisted of John Bender and his wife Elvira and their 2 children, John Jr. and Kate. Though not much is known about their life, throughout their trek they killed dozens of travelers. There isn't much detail about the murders themselves. They were connected to other murders that happened in the same way. For the Bender family themselves, most of what we know is that John Bender, the father, was an old, bitter man and a dirty person, and the rest of the family were a couple of goofballs as well. They were proven to have at least killed 12 people, and like 16 more potentially. They were never caught or tried for their crimes. Stephen Richards. Alright, this is where it starts getting good. Stephen was born in West Virginia in 1856. He would later move to Ohio in a Quaker village. He had the fortune to seek out, and with that, he set off to Iowa. and here, for a short time, he worked as an attendant at a lunatic asylum, where he would bury deceased patients. This would be significant because this is where his life was shaped much significantly, to the fact that he started to have no regard for humanity. Richard left the asylum and started traveling throughout the Midwest. He met a man on horseback and decided to go gambling with him. Richard actually won most of the money, and they even slept next to each other the same night. The next morning, however, the stranger turned on Richards and demanded his money back. Richard then shot him above the left eye, killing him instantly. Several days later, he encountered another man who was traveling on foot. The man had seen Richards and the other guy just days before, so he asked Stephen about the stranger. Richard found out that this guy and the stranger were close associates and business partners. Richard, being sure that this guy knew too much, decided to kill him. Richard then went to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he used fake bills to buy a horse and buggy, but the owner wasn't having it. He tracked Richards down and demanded he either gave him real money or he would have him arrested. Richard then shot him in the head, which in hindsight, he could have just let him have the horse and buggy. Ironically, Richard was arrested for larceny sometime later, though he got out really easily because he claimed that the charge was unfounded. After he was released, he went to Nebraska, where while he was there, he came upon a homestead of Kearney County owned by Miss Harrelson. This is where Richard would kill Miss Harrelson and her 3 children. This dude was full-blown crazy. He had full keep of the farm, and nobody was none the wiser. A neighbor had asked Richard to help him out, since the neighbor thought that Richard was just taking care of the homestead. While there, Richard poisoned him. The neighbor, expecting that he was poisoned, before he died, ran and told his neighbor just to watch out for this guy just in case. When the original neighbor died, the neighbor that he told confronted Richards, in which Richards killed them with an axe. At this point, Richard had to flee. He knew that somebody was gonna wonder where these people were, and right he was. When he arrived in Texas, he was arrested on the spot. With a group of 25,000 people, he was hung on April 26, 1879. Edward Soper. Edward was born in 1855 in Missouri. Little is known about him though. His first crimes, like many others on this list, he stole a horse at the age of 20. Though not long after this, he would commit his first murder, which would be his father. In 1880, Edward hid in a feeding lot and called out for his father. When his father approached, he drew a pistol and shot him 4 times, killing him. He disposed of the weapon and went to his exercises as normal, and if nothing happened. When his father's body was discovered, another man, named Mapps, was convicted and imprisoned. Not long after this, Edward married a woman named Ardella Hunt, and they had 2 children together. They were happy with one another, but at some point had a big disagreement. I don't know, it's about religion or something. There isn't much to complain about at this time. While she and the children were sleeping, Edward killed them by grabbing an axe and bludgeoning them repeatedly. After this, he wrote letters saying that he could not take care of them and that he would rather them die than live in misery. Then he boarded up the house and fled the scene. Neighbors found the bodies and notified authorities, and Edward was on the run for years. He went under a couple different names and married a woman, and he had a child with that woman. 2 years later, randomly, Soper left with the child and left a note saying that the child will be taken care of, which he in turn threw the child in the river and let him drown. He fished him back out and then buried him. For the next month or so, he was just on the run, as an entirely different name. He stumbled across becoming a farmhand, and that is where the police tracked him down, and properly arrested him. He actually pleaded insanity, but was denied. He was then convicted and sentenced to death. He was hanged on March 30th, 1999. Sarah Robinson. Yeah, this one's pretty short. Sarah was born in Ireland and had immigrated to Massachusetts, and she had married a man named Moses, in which they had 5 children. And from 1881 to 1886, a few members of her family suffered similar illnesses. She poisoned her husband, her daughter, and her nephew, all of whom had a life insurance policy. Though, when the eldest daughter of hers died, suspicion grew, and they found all the bodies had heavy arsenic. So, she was promptly arrested by authorities, and Robinson died behind bars in 1906. Frank Hickey. Frank was born in Massachusetts, and according to his testimony, was abused by his father a ton. Well, one day when he was 18 and working at a drugstore, he contacted the police and told him his coworker was dead on the floor. Though no one has suspected it, Frank had poisoned his coworker and killed him. He fled there and ended up in the northeastern United States. He came across an 11-year-old newspaper worker, and Frank told him he would buy all of his newspapers if he followed him to Central Park. Frank strangled him with the newspaper and left his body there. Around 1911, he was working at a steel plant, and near his house, he noticed a boy playing with his father. Well, as soon as the father went inside to grab money for an ice cream truck, Frank took the boy behind a saloon and strangled him and dumped his body in the outside pit. Hickey was found and charged with first-degree murder. He died in prison in 1922. Mary Cohen. Mary was born in Maine and had a good life. She got married and had 3 kids. Unfortunately, one of her children was found dead. She claimed it was a neighbor who did it, though nobody, not even her, was charged. Her other 2 children died of peculiar stomach aches, though all the deaths were soon forgotten. She still decided to pursue her medical career. Sometime later, she got remarried. No, I don't know where the other guy went. 4 days after they got married, he died from acute stomach issues. That's not suspicious at all. She then married another person, this time a fellow widower with a son. The son was 8, and not long after she got there, he got, you guessed it, stomach pains. His body was examined for autopsy, and they found arsenic. Without wasting time, they went and arrested Mary. She was found guilty, and of course died in jail, but due to health issues. The Kelly family. Our second family of serial killers, the Kelly family primarily set their focus in Kansas. William, Kate, Billy, and Kit. They, in total, murdered 11 travelers, whose MO would be to rob and kill the wealthy travelers, who would come across them on their farm in no man's land. A small interesting fact, and more of a theory, is that the Kelly family might be in fact the Bender family just years down the road. But that's just a theory. Anyways, they were captured and one of them had suffered a broken neck because they had fallen off their horse. They were tried and hung. T.J. Hampton. This guy must have not been important at all. Not even Wikipedia has information on him, barely half a page. T.J. committed his first murder, and it was on a train conductor in 1887 in South Carolina. Throughout the years, he moved to Georgia. This is where he would commit another 2 murders. In 1893, Hampton was working at a camp and shot 3 white men. Not long after he was caught, he was charged for those crimes, and he was hanged at Lake City. Yeah, not all these guys are gonna be like Edward Soper. Pleasant Pruitt. Mr. Pruitt was born in Edinburgh in 1840. He is being said as the helm of his family. In 1888, his first wife, Miss Pruitt, suddenly died from poisoning. Everyone in the town was shocked, but nobody expected Mr. Pleasant. A year or two later, he met and married another woman named Naomi Huffman. In 1896, however, the Edinburgh community was shocked when Pleasant accidentally killed his wife. The farmer claimed he was cleaning his shotgun when it accidentally went off. Sounds like someone else we know. Mr. Pruitt was arrested, but there was no clear motive, so he was let go, and met his soon-to-be third wife in Iowa City. After Mr. Pruitt's fortune was gone, his new wife suggested they turn their home into a boarding house. While the records state he was growing depressed, he plotted to kill her soon after. In 1902, after his son from the previous marriage had left for school one day, he followed his wife into the bathroom downstairs and stabbed her twice in the chest. While he left the basement, instead of making an escape, he took out a .38 revolver and shot himself in the head. H. Holmes. H. Holmes was born in New Hampshire, and everything about him says he was a wealthy con artist, and the dude even had a mansion. But within this mansion were torture chambers and gas rooms and things like that. The folklore behind him is that he would lure people into his house and murder them, though there isn't much evidence for that. However, he did kill people who worked within the castle, the first being his mistress, and though her body was never found, she disappeared on Christmas Eve of 1891. Then, 2 other girls went and disappeared a few months later. He had confessed to a total of 27 murders when he was arrested in November of 1894, and he was only arrested for having a warrant on horse tax. So in total, there would be nearly 30 murders committed, even though he only ended up being on trial for 2. When he was found guilty, he confessed to the other ones. He was hung at the prison he was staying in 1896. Luis Vermilla. Luis was born in Illinois in 1868 and was one of the oldest out of 11 siblings. When she was 16, she married a 24-year-old named Fred and moved to northern Illinois. In 1893, however, Luis would kill her first husband by mysterious circumstances. He had children of his own, 2 of which would die mysteriously after Fred's death. In 1906, she moved to Chicago, where she would claim the life of her other stepdaughter. She actually did this a few more times as she remarried. She killed the husband, killed the kid of his, and well, yeah. What was ironic is that she was struck with a disease that left her almost paralyzed. She tried to commit suicide, and when she was found and revived, this was the only time speculation had arisen to her crimes. However, she died in 1913, technically never getting charged with any of the crimes. Alfred Knapp. Alfred was born in 1863 in Indiana, and he actually spent most of his early life behind bars for the abuse of various women. It was actually not until 1903 when his third wife disappeared while they were living in Cincinnati. He claimed that he woke up that morning with the urge to strangle her to death, which is what he did. He then went on to marry another girl, but not long after this, he was caught by police. I would say this is where the story would end, but he has to kill other people. While interrogated, he actually confessed to 4 other murders. He murdered his second wife, 2 random strangers, and a child. This is the first on our list to be sentenced to the electric chair, and he died in 6 minutes after the initial shock. Edward Walton. Edward was born in Wilkes County. His first crime ever was actually killing a horse in 1890. While in Illinois in 1902, he married a woman who would become his future victim. At some point, she was away from Edward for 2 hours, and for this reason, he would travel to where she was and shoot her 3 times. He fled to Chicago immediately, where he met another woman, and, for some reason, this is where things get shaky. He, kicked a woman in the chest really hard, and it was some stranger, not his wife, and she died, so he fled the country. I don't know, it was really weird, and information on it was hard to find, so leave me alone. He arrived back in West Virginia, and at some point, he met another woman. After trying to sway her to sleep with him, she said no, and Edward got mad and killed her. After this, he got chased by an angry mob of 400 people. He made his way into a barn and barricaded himself in there. While he was there, he was surrounded, and he gave himself up when the town sheriff said he was going to blow up the barn if he didn't come out. He was tried and sentenced to death. He was hanged in 1908 in front of a couple dozen people. John Robinson. John was born in 1867 in Nashville, Tennessee. This dude is known as the family murderer, and you'll soon see why. You see, he married his first wife Ella on the morning of 1896. John was convinced that Ella was seeing another man and cheating on him. And of course, she wasn't. He was so mad that he began to choke her and just didn't stop. He tried to flee through a ship, and he was actually caught. He was then sentenced to 15 years. But he actually was released on parole only after serving a few years. He moved to Kansas after he was allowed to leave, and this is where he met a woman named Mary. John was paranoid that Mary would go rat him out to the police because all he would do is cheat on her. One night, in April of 1913, he got a butcher knife and went into Mary's room and strangled her to death. He then severed every limb she had. He went to his young stepdaughter's room and did the same thing. A piece of limb was found by a neighbor who alerted authorities, and a warrant was out for Robinson. He was caught at Lee's Summit, where he was instantly turned back to the police station. He was hung at Gallows Alley in Kansas City. Martin Stickles. Martin was born in Iowa in 1870 and eventually moved to Washington, at which point, when he got older, lived by himself as a fisherman and sailed along the coast. His first victim was a bachelor farmer named William, who Martin had known since his youth. One day, while he was eating supper, Martin took a rifle and shot him through the window. After this, he broke in and stole all of his valuables, and promptly lit the house on fire, not to leave any evidence behind. Nearly a year later, Martin traveled to a Castle Rock where an older couple were having dinner at their table. Just like the previous murder, he shot them with a rifle through the window and stole all their valuables, but didn't set the house on fire this time though. He was brought into an interrogation about the murders and first claimed he did nothing, then claimed a neighbor was up to it all, and that he was just simply an accomplice. In 1901, Martin was brought to the gallows and hung. Alright, we have finally hit the 1900s. That's not so bad. Please take this time to pause the video, go pee, go get some food. I'll probably put an ad somewhere around here. So, please enjoy the rest of the video. Haiti Witten. Haiti was born in 1862 in Maine, and at some point, early in her life, married a man named Harry and had 3 children. Harry then died under mysterious circumstances, most likely a result of being poisoned by Haiti. Months after the death of Harry, Haiti would develop a morphine addiction. Sometime in September of 1902, a few years after her husband's death, her eldest became very ill and died as well. The coroner said that it was from meningitis, but that was under skepticism since the eldest daughter was usually very healthy. About a month after the eldest daughter's death, tragedy struck again, when the second oldest had died as well. This brought up a ton of questions, and when all the family's bodies were rechecked out, there was not only arsenic in their bodies, but they also found strychnine, which gave them all right to arrest Haiti and had her in custody. She had someone who was supposed to keep watch of her while she was in custody, so she could be tried for her crimes. However, when the person watching her left for a few minutes, she got 2 towels, formed them into a noose, and took her own life. Eugene Butler. Eugene was born in 1849 in Royalton, New York. Coming from a wealthy family, Butler bought 480 acres of land in North Dakota and lived as a recluse. At the start of his exodus, his family had said that Eugene experienced mental health problems like visual and tactile hallucinations. He claimed that invisible people were stalking him, and his mind deteriorated further by 1906. He would scream at the top of his lungs into the night, scaring the other residents in the process. He would later be admitted into a mental asylum for disturbing the peace, where he would eventually die in 1913. 2 years after Butler's death, his estate began to excavate the property for renovation. One of the workers found a cellar underneath the house, where he found 6 sets of skeletons. All had their skulls crushed, and 2 had their legs broken. Eugene Butler was posthumously named the Great Plains Butcher. The town never reported anyone missing within the town, and all of his victims are unidentified to this day. Belle Gunness. Belle was born in November of 1859 to the name of Brynhild Storsett in Norway. By 14 years old, Storsett saved enough money to travel to the United States by working on farms and dairies. By 1881, Storsett moved to the United States and changed her name to Belle. She moved to Chicago with her sister, who emigrated a few years earlier, where she got a job at a butcher shop. Belle was known to be a tall woman for the time and had a strong masculine appearance. Belle began killing when she killed her first husband's children by poisoning them in 1884. Her husband, Mad Sorson, had 2 life policies on the kids, and in 1900, soon after activating them, he died as well from cerebral hemorrhage. Belle claimed her husband came home with a headache and died later that day. She would collect the life policy on Mads and his children and would move to Indiana. Belle would marry a single father, Peter Gunness, in 1902, and a week after, Peter's infant daughter would die under Belle's care, and 8 months later, Peter would die from a skull injury. Belle collected the insurance money afterwards and adopted her late husband's name. She began placing ads for marriage around the Chicago area, where she would marry, murder, and take the life policies that were placed. By 1908, she had murdered well over 10 men. Her crimes went unnoticed until Gunness's farmhouse burnt to the ground in April of 1908. Authorities found headless women and 3 of her own children from previous marriages. Excavations later found 11 bodies on the property. The coroner, who performed an autopsy on the headless corpse, noted that the body was almost half a foot shorter and weighed considerably less than that of Belle Gunness. One of Gunness's lovers, Ray Lamphere, claimed that Gunness had him murder her children and that the adult female body was a murder victim. Gunness had murdered as one of Gunness's victim's brother was to visit the farmhouse to investigate the disappearance. When Lamphere was arrested, he was wearing Gunness's victim's coat and watch. There is still debate whether or not Belle Gunness died on that night. Bertha Gifford. Bertha was born in 1871 in Missouri and had a total of 9 other siblings. Like some others, not much is known about her early life, mostly because she was never accused of her crimes. You see, Bertha had the job of taking care of sick people in her town. 5 people mysteriously died in her care, and this of course resulted in a grand jury investigating. She was put on trial, and all the bodies were found with arsenic. During the 3-day trial, she was convicted, but for reason of insanity. She was committed to a state hospital, and that's where she stayed until she died in 1951. Sid Jones. Sid is very mysterious, all the way to the point of we don't know his birthday or any early life information. His earliest victim was a sheriff who had just done a random stop, and Sid decided to shoot him. Sid, of course, was arrested and caught and sent to jail. While he was there, he was only to serve a few years, but while in jail, he decided to murder 2 convicts. He was caught and charged for one of them, and that was the final straw. On June 25, 1915, Sid was hung among 3 other convicts. Santiago Garduno. Santiago was born in New Mexico in 1893. A lot of early parts of his life are unknown, but he at one point moved to Colorado, and this is where he would commit his first murder. though he would only spend about 6 years and be released on good behavior. Though he committed an entirely different murder, the key witness died, so the case was thrown out. In 1925, a few years after his second murder, he was at a local dance party where he got into a fight, and during the altercation, Santiago pulled out a gun and shot at the opposing side and killed a young man named Paulin. Santiago was caught and served 9 years and was released on parole. In 1932, Santiago poisoned his stepson with whiskey that had strychnine. The court had ruled that this was his last life he was going to take, and on July 21st, 1933, Santiago was executed in the electric chair. Monroe Betterton. Monroe was born in Missouri in 1872, and I thought the last few serial killers had big families, but this guy had 14 other siblings. When he became an adult, he married a woman named Laura, and they had several children. In 1904, they had problems within their marriage, and they argued constantly. During their final argument, an enraged Monroe beat Laura into unconsciousness, and then the neighbors who heard the argument came in and rushed her to the hospital, where she would die later. And for some reason, he was never charged. So not long after, he hired a woman named Rose to be his housekeeper, and not long after, decided to marry her. They also had issues as well, and one night, after a few drinks at the pub on his way home, he and his new wife had an altercation, and he pulled out a knife and stabbed her multiple times. This was in public too, because people on a train came in and rushed her to the hospital and Monroe to jail. This dude was pretty crazy. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison, and in spite of this, however, he got paroled in 1917. Not long after that, he met another woman named Elzada, and they had a strain in their relationship. How did this guy convince any woman to marry him? Anyways, they had a rocky relationship, to the point where they had a divorce and got remarried. And when they got remarried on their honeymoon, him and his wife got into another altercation. This time he pulled out a revolver and shot her 3 times. He was then rushed to jail because of a nearby couple. Something to note is that he said if he was ever let out, he would kill himself and the rest of his family. Yikes. On July 9th, 1920, he was electrified. Mose Gibson. Details about Gibson's early life are scarce, but it is believed that he was born in Louisiana. A whole bunch of discrepancies within the case files of this guy, but what is known, or what he has confessed to, is a murder of 7 random people. Well, not random, the first being his boss. He robbed him and then beat him to death. He then slew a couple just because he wanted to rob them, and literally a few months later, traveled to a ranch to murder and rob a wealthy rancher. The only reason he was caught was that he was trying to buy tickets to Albuquerque, and they were checked by the conductor, and the conductor called the police to check on that guy, and then he was promptly arrested. And while he was being arrested, he was acting suspiciously and then just confessed to the 7 murders. Sadly, he never had a trial and was just hanged a week after killing himself. I'm saying that he should have a trial like the rest of these monsters kinda had. Quejo. Quejo was born in 1880 in Nevada, and this is the first Nevadian serial killer. In his youth, he was an outcast and he took odd jobs, and he is said to have killed his half-brother. I swear, that was the quote straight from the source. And he killed a 100-year-old blind Indian. He attempted to flee, and any posse that would try and get him, he would kill. See, this is the first guy that I found that sounds like he may be more of a myth, but like he has a gravestone and all that, so he's gotta be real, right? Anyways, he was on the run for a while, and is said to have killed 23, but 13 people are confirmed. When they found his body, it was discovered with dynamite and blasting caps, so who knows what was going on. But he lived until he was at least 50. Amy Archer Gillian. Amy was born on Halloween in 1873 as Amy Duggan. Amy had a normal 19th century childhood, living in Connecticut. Eventually, Amy married James Archer in 1897. In 1901, the couple would become caretakers for a widower, John Seymour, and moved into his home. Seymour died from natural causes, and his estate turned into his house into a boarding home for the elderly, and Archers provided a care for the elders and paid rent. However, Seymour's estate sold the home, and the Archers moved to Windsor, Connecticut, to start their own boarding home. James died in 1910 from Blight's disease, but Amy took out a life insurance policy a few weeks before his death. The policy helped continue her boarding business. In 1913, Amy married a widower with 4 sons, Michael Gillian. Gillian was a wealthy man who was very interested in investing in Archer's business. Gillian would die the next year from severe digestion. Before his death, Gillian wrote his will, giving Archer his entire estate. Between 1907 and 1910, 12 residents died in the Archer boarding home. However, between 1911 and 1916, that accelerated to 48 deaths. Some of the residents were completely healthy. The increase in deaths led to suspicions from the residents' relatives. One of the relatives went to the press, who published an article titled, "Murder Factory." It took police a year to raid her property, where they found 5 bodies, including her second husband. The bodies had signs of arsenic poisoning. After that evidence was found, she was arrested in 1917. Amy was convicted of 1 murder and sentenced to death. By 1924, she was declared as temporarily insane and was placed in a sane asylum where she lived until her death in 1962. Clementine Barnabet. Barnabet's exact birth date is unknown, but is placed around 1894 to 1895 in Louisiana. Clementine's father, Raymond, was a violent man who abused the family. He was accused of murdering the Andreas family of 4 with an axe in 1911, but was let go due to a lack of evidence. However, was rearrested and convicted of the murders. Clementine testified against her father, telling the court that Raymond came home with bloody clothes and boasted about the murders, while Raymond was in prison. A family of 6 were murdered in their home with an axe a few blocks away from the Barbanet residence, and Clementine came under suspicion. When Clementine was in jail, another family was murdered, casting doubt on her involvement. Clementine would confess to 35 murders, claiming a priestess gave her hoodoo luck charms that would make them invisible. Her confessions were contradictory in nature as she changed details like working alone or with an accomplice. She was convicted of 1 murder in 1912, but was released in 1923 due to a surgical operation that cured her from her wickedness. After she was released, her whereabouts are unknown. Will Lockett. Petrie Kimbrough, better known as Will Lockett, murdered 3 women and 1 girl between 1912 and 1920. Born in 1896 in Christian County, Kentucky, Kimbrough used the alias Will Lockett when he began traveling. Lockett was a black man who suffered from racism in the Jim Crow South. At the age of 16, Lockett would travel to Carmi, Illinois, where he would murder a white woman near a pair of train tracks. Lockett refrained from killing until 1917, when Lockett would brutally beat, rape, and murder a black woman in Indiana. He enlisted in the Army in 1918 and served in World War I. After being stationed at Camp Zachary Taylor the next year after, the war was over. By strangulation. In February 1920, a 10-year-old white girl, Geneva, was walking home from school when she disappeared. Her possessions were found near a cornfield by a farmer who correctly thought the items were from a student. The farmer returned the items to the Hardman's school, where her teacher recognized they were Hardman's. The teacher sent students to Hardman's home, where her mother was waiting for her. Locals returned to the spot where Hardman's things were found, and they found tracks left by a large man. They followed the tracks leading to a large boulder behind the cornfield, where the body of Geneva. Her body was covered in blood, and her head was caved in by a rock. No screams were heard, but another farmer did say he saw a large black man with his pants covered in mud walking along the field. Locals used bloodhounds to find Lockett in a neighboring town, who said his name was Hamilton. Lockett later revealed his real identity and confessed to all the murders he committed. He was arrested and later pleaded guilty to the murder of Geneva. During sentencing, a mob formed to kill Lockett. As a result, police and the National Guard opened fire on the mob, killing 6. Lockett expressed remorse to Geneva's murder, and he was executed by electric chair in March of 1920. Louise Peet. To a wealthy newspaper publisher in 1880, Louise had a normal childhood. However, she was expelled from her private school at the age of 15. Afterwards, she began her criminal tendencies, like stealing and engaging in sexual activities with her male former classmates. In 1913, she married a traveling salesman who later committed suicide after finding Louise sleeping with another man. His death rocked Louise, who became a prostitute and moved to Boston as a result. Louise tried to mingle with wealthy families in the area, and she successfully integrated into one just for the purpose of stealing. When her real identity was discovered, she was allowed to leave without embarrassment from the family. Louise moved to Texas, where she shot and robbed an oilman, John Apple. She was arrested, where she claimed self-defense. She was acquitted of the murder. Louise's patterns of marrying and killing her husbands caught up with her, as she was executed for murder in 1947 by the gas chamber. Lydia Southard. Lydia was born in 1892 in Missouri, and around her early 20s, she married a man named Robert. She and he stayed with his brother, Edward, and they had a baby girl named Lorraine. Unfortunately, Lorraine died unexpectedly just 2 years after she was born, and not long after, her husband dies as well. The cause of death were ruled potassium poisoning, and not long after that, Edward, the house owner, died of typhoid fever. 2 years after his death, and insurance money was collected, Lydia married again to another man named William, and of course, a year later, he died with the case being diphtheria. In March 1919, less than a year later, she married Harlan Lewis, and 3 months after that, he fell ill with gastritis. She didn't marry anyone after that. Ironically, she was charged because her original husband's autopsy was redone and they found the initial poison inside him. They charged her with second-degree murder. She spent her last days in prison and actually died from a heart attack in 1958. George Hassel. George was born in Texas, and he was born of the youngest of 7. He is known for killing his entire family in one house in one night. The story goes that while he and his wife are arguing, he struck her in the face repeatedly with a ball-peen hammer, killing her in the process. He then continued to move to each family member of the house, from oldest to youngest, using a straight razor stocking. One of the 2 younger boys woke up, and George grabbed a shotgun and killed him. And when he was the final one, after they all died, he disposed of their body underneath his house. The whole reason he was ever suspected was that a few days after his spree, he had a yard sale of all the family's belongings, and someone from law enforcement drove over the sinkhole where the bodies were covered. After a little digging in his front yard, all the bodies were uncovered. He was found guilty of the murder and sentenced to death. On February 10, 1929, George became the 37th man to be put to death by the electric chair in the state of Texas. Edward Adams. Edward was born in Kansas in 1887. He had a difficult childhood. His father died when he was young, and his stepfather was fairly brutal. In 1921, when Edward was much older, he formed a partnership with Ray and Walter, who were outlaw brothers. And on September 5th, he was part of a daytime robbery against a rival crew. A shootout happened, which ended up in the death of a gambler and gunman, Frank Gardner. Edward was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. While being transported, he escaped and jumped off the train he was on. He was captured days later attempting to rob a bank, and that added 15 years to his current life sentence. Following this, he escaped yet again, though how he escaped imprisonment this time is highly speculated. Once he escaped though, he was out for a long time. He had other posses that he was with, and they had their own killing spree with the death of 3 people. The final being a farmhand who had his truck stolen by Edwards and his right hand. You see, he was being chased after a shooting cop who had pulled him over while he was on the run. He stumbled onto this farm, and when Edward asked for the man's car, he resisted and Edward shot him. So, with the stolen car, a shootout ensued, and Edward tried to kill the police officers, but he was shot and killed in the process. Carl Panzram. Carl was born in Minnesota in 1891 and had 6 other siblings. Carl's run-ins with the law started early. In 1899, at age 8, he was charged in juvenile court with being drunk and disorderly at the age of 8. In 1920, he committed his first serious crime. He stole a man named Taft's entire fortune, and it was with this fortune he would commit his murder spree. With the money, he bought a yacht and embarked on an 8-year-long murder spree which spanned several countries and involved multiple victims. They would mostly be sailors, and he would lure them from the port on his yacht, rape them, and kill them. He would continue to kill a grand total of 21 human beings. On August 30th, 1928, Carl was arrested in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. for a burglary, stealing a radio and jewelry from a home of a dentist on August 20th. This would be his final sight to the world. Panzram was hanged on September 5th, 1930. Charles Barr. Little is known about Barr's life. He was born in Memphis in 1903, and when he became an adult, he happily married a woman named Luata and was seen as a hardworking citizen. Despite his reputation, Barr wished for a more lavish lifestyle, believing the quickest way to do so was to turn to robberies. On January 27, 1923, Barr borrowed a car from a friend and drove to an isolated road near Memphis, which was known as the local Lover's Lane. When he arrived, there was a couple in their vehicle. Charles parked his car, got out on foot, and approached. Inside was Duncan and Ruth Young. Charles pulled out a .25 caliber pistol and shot Duncan, killing him instantly. Frightened, Ruth leaped out of her car and sprinted towards a nearby field. Barr caught up with her and raped her and shot her as well. The bodies were later discovered by a milkman doing his daily routine. Despite the police's and local citizens' detective agencies' attempts to solve the case, nobody was arrested for the crime at the time. Exactly 4 months later, Charles took the exact same car, went to the exact same spot, but here he had stumbled upon Spencer and Laura. He attempted to stealthily approach their car, but he was noticed by Spencer, who had screamed and was shot at instantly. Charles shot at Laura too, however, knowing that she wasn't dead, Charles was going to take her as a hostage. But while she was in the moving vehicle, she jumped out, ran to a neighbor's house, and was rushed to a hospital. About a year later, the lead detective on the case recognized a watch from Duncan, the first murder, at a pawn shop, and started backpedaling to figure out how the watch was acquired by the pawn owner. They figured out it was Charles, and he was arrested for the murder. They found the gun he used among other things that gave him really no way out. He confessed to all 3 crimes and was killed by electric chair in 1926. Martha Wise. Martha was born in 1883 in Ohio, and she was the middle child of 5. In 1906, Martha met the substantially older Albert Wise at a box social. They got married shortly thereafter. The marriage was not happy. Martha moved onto Albert's 50-acre farm. Albert had anticipated a wife farmhand versus a wife. They together had a total of 4 children. Not long after the 4th child was born, Albert suddenly died in 1922, leaving his wife, a 40-year-old widow, with 4 children. Within a year of his death, Martha found a new husband by the name of Walter, but they ended up getting a divorce. On Thanksgiving evening in 1924, several members of the family, including Martha's mother, Sophie, fell ill with a severe stomach ailment. All the others except for Sophie recovered, and she died later the next month. New Year's Eve brought more illness. Her new husband's aunt and uncle, Lily and Fred, and several of their children all began suffering stomach pains similar to those Sophie had experienced before her death. Everyone except Lily and Fred, they had unfortunately passed. In total, 17 relatives were taken ill with similar symptoms. After the final relative passed, the sheriff discovered Martha had been to a pharmacy and bought high amounts of arsenic. When asked about this, she first claimed that she was using it for rats, but eventually she confessed to attempting and poisoning her family. Even though she confessed to the crimes, she pleaded not guilty. She was then indicted on first-degree murder. In 1962, as a result of good behavior, she commuted her sentence to second degree, and she was paroled at 79. But, ironically, there was no family or anyone on the outside world to take her, so what's the only thing she knows? She goes back to live at the jail, and a few months later, she died in prison on June 28, 1971. Peter Kudzinowski. Peter was born in 1903 in Pennsylvania to Polish parents, and he was the youngest of 4 older brothers. Everything in his life was relatively normal though. In the 6th grade, he had suffered a skull fracture, and this has some correlation on his behavior because he was instantly turned a tad bit more bitter and didn't like going to school and whatnot. Anyways, in 1924, he and his friend Harry were looking for a job at a water supply company. The two of them had gotten into an altercation while drunk, and Peter struck his head with a rock and killed him. Nobody expected nonetheless because Peter hid the body so well. It is still yet to be discovered to this day, and his family thought that he was out traveling the world. I would think at this point he would want to try and keep a low profile during this time, so he lay dormant for about 4 years. Around August of 1928, he was around Jersey City, and he was staying around Lake Hopkong. Julia was at a school picnic at the lake. Peter murdered her and ditched her body miles away. In November of that same year, he met a young boy who was 7, and Peter lured him with candy in a motion picture show. He led him a good mile away, and the boy attempted to flee, but Peter grabbed him, slashed his throat, and covered the boy with his coat and left him there. Peter was jailed for public intoxication in December of that year, and was released later that day, and he had drunkenly said to a police traffic booth worker that he was wanted by the police. He later was interviewed by police again, and this is where he would confess to all 3 murders. On December 21st of 1929, he was executed by electric chair. Albert Fish. Known by many monikers like the Brooklyn Vampire, Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Boogeyman, and most infamously, the Gray Man. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, to a family of history with mental illness. His mother, Ellen, suffered from hallucinations. Fish's brother, Edwin, was sent to multiple mental institutions. His uncle suffered from mania. His father, Randall, was 75 years old, and when Fish was born, he was 43 years older than his mother, Ellen. Randall would die 5 years later after Fish's birth from a heart attack. Fish would take up the name Albert from a previous dead sibling. His mother would place Albert, who spent much of his childhood in St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C., where he would develop his depravity. Albert would receive beatings from other children, such as being whipped, but grew to enjoy it. By 1880, his mother was able to get Fish out of the orphanage, but the damage was already done. At the age of 12, he began a relationship with another boy, where they performed fetishes like drinking urine and eating feces. Albert was a voyeur and spied on boys and girls undressing in public bathrooms. By 1890, Albert became a male prostitute and a serial rapist, as he preyed upon mostly boys that haven't hit puberty. By 1898, Albert's mother arranged him to marry Anna Hoffman, whom Albert would have 6 children with. The marriage lasted until 1917, when Anna would leave Albert for another man, leaving Albert to be a single parent. Albert was seen as a harmless man and never abused his own children. Albert began to harm himself with the nail-studded paddle by hitting his buttocks with it. He also encouraged his kids to hit him with it as well. Albert would start his application on others as he, in 1910, would start a sodomastic relationship with a disabled man who Albert took to an abandoned farmhouse and tortured him for 10 days. Albert cut the man's penis off and cleaned it with the wound with peroxide, gave him a $10 bill, kissed him on the head, and left him. Albert would later say he didn't know or try to find out what happened to him. In 1919, Albert stabbed a mentally handicapped boy in Georgetown in D.C. because he thought he wouldn't be missed if he had murdered him. The boy survived his injuries. Albert traveled to Staten Island in 1924 when he attempted to abduct an 8-year-old Beatrice offering her money to find crops in the forest. Her mother caught Albert and chased him away. Albert, 3 days later, crossed the line when he abducted and murdered an 8-year-old Frances McDonald. Albert sexually assaulted and strangled McDonald while lacerating his body. His body was found hanging on a tree. Eyewitnesses said that an old gray man was seen with McDonald. 3 years later, Albert kidnapped 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in front of his friend, who said the boogeyman took him, when asked by authorities. Gaffney's body was never found, but Albert wrote a letter to his lawyer after his arrest, detailing on it that he tortured and murdered and ate Gaffney. The next year, Albert responded to an ad by 18-year-old Edward Budd, who needed some work. Albert met with the Budd family and became obsessed with Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace. Albert used a fake name and promised Edward work. He failed to do that and apologized to the family. He convinced the family to take Grace to a party he was attending. Albert took Grace to an abandoned building where he murdered and cut up her body for consumption. In 1934, Albert anonymously sent a letter to Grace's mother mentioning a famine in Hong Kong and accurately detailing the abduction. The letter was in mocking nature. The letter would lead to Albert's arrest, where he did not attempt to lie about the murders. His trial began on March 11, 1935. He pleaded insanity, but was found guilty and sentenced to death after 10 days. Albert officially killed 3 children, but is likely to have killed up to 9 children. Albert made a final statement which was so depraved that his lawyer refused to release it to the public, saying, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities I have ever read." Albert Fish was executed on January 16, 1936 by the electric chair. Earl Nelson. Earl's life was somewhat unfortunate. He lost both of his parents before he was 2, and he was sent to live with his maternal grandmother. He showed a lot of self-loathing and morbid behavior at a young age. Around the age of 10, he collided with a streetcar while on his bicycle. This caused him to be unconscious for 6 days, and when he came to, he became erratic and suffered memory loss. I would like to mention that he did spend time at a Napa State mental hospital after he would continuously enlist in the military just to desert. Anyways, in 1926, a woman named Clara Newman was selling her home, and Earl, pretending to be a tenant, was granted entry into her home. Earl strangled her and then committed narcolepsy. His second victim, a 63-year-old Laura Beale, was also strangled in her home, and did the same thing to 20 other women and 1 young boy. The whole police chase of this was a joke because they had this guy twice and then he escaped using disguises and whatnot. Once he was finally arrested, he was only charged with the murders of 2 people and 2 molestation charges. He was hung on January 13, 1928. Gordon Northcott. Gordon was the perpetrator of the Wineville chicken coop murders. He was born on November 9, 1906. He was a Canadian man. He claimed that his father sodomized him at the age of 10. Although Gordon was known to be a pathological liar, many believe that this is true. The Northcott family moved to LA in 1924. He asked his father to buy land where the murders would eventually take place. There, he built a house and chicken ranch from the help of his father and nephew, whom Gordon brought from Canada. Gordon would kidnap boys, take them to his ranch, and molest them. Usually, he would take them home afterwards. Gordon also began to sexually abuse his nephew and forced him to write letters to home saying that he was okay. Sanford's sister became concerned about Sanford's safety. She visited the ranch for 3 days, and when Sanford told her about the crimes Gordon was committing in confidence, he told her that Gordon and his mother had murdered 4 boys, including the infamous case of Walter Collins, whom was abducted off the streets after going to see a movie. Sanford's sister traveled back to Canada where she informed an American consul about Gordon's crimes. The consul contacted the LAPD about it. Gordon saw agents driving to his property and he fled along with his mother to Canada while his nephew stalled the agents, eventually telling the agents that Gordon had fled. The agents found 3 shallow graves of not bodies, but body parts of 3 young boys. Gordon, along with Sanford, went to the desert to burn the bodies and bury what was left. The 4th victim was of an identified headless Mexican boy found on the side of the road. Sanford testified that Gordon forced him to burn the head in a pit and smash the skull. Gordon and his mother were arrested in British Columbia and extradited back to LA. Gordon's mother confessed to murdering Walter Collins and receiving life imprisonment, but was paroled in 1940 and died in 1944. Gordon recanted a confession that he made about killing more than 5 boys. Gordon was tried, convicted, and executed by hanging in October 1932. Gordon was a nervous wreck while heading to the gallows and begged for his life. The rope was too short for his weight and took him 13 minutes to die. He was 23 years old. Rhonda Martin. There is not much information about Rhonda, but she was born in 1907 in Alabama. Rhonda worked as a waitress and struggled to make ends meet. She was married 5 times, which includes her stepson, Ronald Martin, who was her 5th husband, whom she later attempted to murder. Rhonda fed rat poison to 2 previous husbands, her mother, and 3 of her children, over the course of 14 years, between 1937 and 1951. Her attempted murder on her final husband led her to being caught. Her motive is unknown, as she never collected the life policies of her family, although she did love to receive sympathy cards from people after their deaths, which could be a clue as to why she did it. She was only convicted of 1 murder and was sentenced to death, which she was via the electric chair. She was the last woman in Alabama to be executed until 2002. Frederick Wood. Frederick was born in 1911 in New York. There isn't too much information on his early life though. He engaged in petty crimes as soon as he hit adolescence. He avoided many repercussions from this though. In 1933, Frederick consistently used prostitutes, and he was just a bitter man. He eventually got a venereal disease, and that made him develop a hatred towards women. How that makes sense, I do not know. But randomly, Wood started harassing women on the streets until he saw a woman named Pearl in a suburban backyard. After grabbing hold of her, Wood strangled Pearl and stabbed her 142 times. Yes, 142 times, with a knife, in various locations. The crime horrified the community. That following month, he was arrested for harassing a woman named Grace at a Broadway pharmacy, which he was found guilty and served 7 years at a local reformatory. In 1940, he was discharged and returned home. 2 years later, after perceiving a local carpenter had been pestering his girlfriend, Wood invited him into a rooming house in the city. In a drunken rage, Wood hit him on the head with a beer bottle, and when the man fell, Wood stopped his head and slashed him with a knife. Wood stuffed the body underneath the couch to keep it concealed. He told his wife about the incident, which in turn told her mother, which in turn called the police, resulting in an immediate murder charge for which Wood would quickly be convicted and sentenced to 20 years to life. Shortly after this, his original murder was discovered, March 21st, 1963. Nanny Doss. Nanny was born in 1905 in Alabama, and she had 4 other siblings. Her father was rather abusive to her mother and other siblings. At the age of 7, Nanny had hit her head on a metal bar, and for years following, she suffered a severe headache and blackouts. Though we are unsure if this affected her future habits, but we'll see. Nanny was first married at the age of 16 with her father's approval. Their marriage produced 4 daughters. In 1927, the two lost their middle 2 girls, and it's suspected to be food poisoning. The couple soon divorced, and all the husband had to say about it was that he was afraid of her. She soon had a second husband of a man named Harrison, though this lasts 16 years. One night, Harrelson raped her, and she used rat poison in his whiskey the evening after. She did this 2 more times, and on the last husband, the hospital decided to do a check on his internals, and they found enough rat poison to kill, let's say, a lot of rats. She was promptly arrested. Doss confessed to killing 4 of her husbands, her mother, her sister, her grandson, and her mother-in-law. She was sentenced to life in prison. The state did not pursue the death penalty due to her sex. She died of leukemia in 1965. Herman Allen. This guy has no early life information. Allen lived somewhere in North Carolina and had a wife who I could not find the first name of, and at some point they took in a 50-year-old lodger named Handy, and ironically, one night Allen woke up hearing a noise and he wasn't able to find his wife. He peered into Handy's room and saw him and Miss Allen having an affair. He confronted his wife about it, who first claimed that nothing had happened, but then she said she did it. He went to a neighbor's house, borrowed a shotgun, and shot Handy in the chest and killed him. He then went to a deputy sheriff's house and confessed. He was promptly sentenced to 20 years in prison. He actually ended up only serving 4 years after being released and returned to his home. He remarried Ruth Lee, and that's awkward. They lived undisturbed until 1942. He had suspected that his wife Ruth and another man named Rayner had been sleeping together. He got a 16-gauge shotgun and went to Rayner's house, called him outside, and then shot him. For some reason, he went to his mother-in-law's house and killed his brother-in-law and took his wife by the hair to the barn and shot her. By that time, neighbors could hear what was going on and obviously called the police. He was promptly arrested, and on October 30th, 1942, Allen was executed inside a gas chamber in Central Prison. Alfred Klein. Alfred was born in 1888, and unfortunately, he was never convicted of the 9 murders he caused because there was no supporting evidence. Pretty much what he would do is he would marry a woman of high status, then somehow convince them to move all of their high-valued possessions into his name, and then he would persuade them to drink a glass of buttermilk, that's fucking nasty. A local doctor would then issue a death certificate of heart failure. Alfred was prosecuted for a murder charge but ended up getting jailed for forgery and was sentenced to 126 years. So he ended up in jail, I guess, just not the way he needed to be. Harry Powers. Harry Powers was born in 1893 in the Netherlands. He immigrated to the United States in 1910 and ended up in West Virginia in 1926. Around a year later, he married a woman who owned a grocery store. Although he was married to another woman, Powers began to post ads on the paper claiming to be a single man looking for a wife. In 1931, using the alias Cornelius Orvin Pearson, Powers wrote letters to a widow with 3 kids by the name of Asta Eacher, who was living in Illinois. Powers visited Eacher and her kids, where Powers and Eacher left for a few days while one of Eacher's friends would watch the children. Powers came back without Eacher and tried to get one of the kids to cash a check to the bank, but the signature was a forgery. Powers and Eacher's kids left soon after. The next month, Powers convinced a woman, Dorothy, who was living in Massachusetts. Powers took Dorothy to Iowa to wed, and Powers persuaded her to withdraw $4,000 out of her account. She also disappeared soon after. Police were investigating the disappearance of Eacher and her children when they searched her home and found love letters to Powers' alias. The letters had Powers' addresses in West Virginia, which led to his arrest later that month. The police had found a garage that Powers had built years earlier, where they found bloody clothing and bloody footprints of a child. It was this garage where the murders took place. Powers murdered Eacher and her daughters by strangulation and her son by beating him with a hammer. A bystander unknowingly helped Powers dig a ditch where he would bury the 5. Dorothy was found with a belt wrapped around her neck. Powers was subsequently charged with murder and, like most killers on this list, was tried and executed by hanging on March 18, 1932. Anna Hahn. Anna was born in 1906 and was the youngest of 12 children. At the age of 9, she became pregnant with a boy, and no one to this day knows who the real father is. Her family sent her to live in the United States and made her leave her son with them. While she was there, she met a German immigrant named Philip, and they married in 1930. So Anna's shtick was to poison old men at her job at an old folks' home. She did this to support her gambling habit. So her first victim was an old man who she had befriended before she killed him. He left a house for her in his will. Following him was another old man after she began caring for him, and this time she had an IOU in her name from him, and right after his death, they disappeared. She did this 3 other times and had a total of $3,500 plus a home in her name. So, with her last victim, she poisoned him with a whole ton of arsenic, and the family wanted an autopsy done on the body. So, you know what happened. She became a prime suspect and got. It only took the court a few weeks, and only after the year that she was arrested, she was sentenced to death by the electric chair. Clifford Gales. Clifford was born in 1913 in Ohio, and sadly, I have very little information on this guy, but I do know when he committed his first murder. In 1934, he was with his girlfriend behind a YMCA, and they had gotten into an altercation. Then a scuffle, which Clifford promptly pulled out a knife and stabbed her 9 times in the heart. Afterwards, he dropped the knife in the alley and instantly went to the police station and confessed. As a result, he was charged with first-degree murder. He was found guilty and subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment for the crime. He had served 10 years, which was the minimum before he was eligible for parole. He was then released. Why? I'm not sure though. He at some point developed a relationship with an underage girl who lived with her older sister. Clifford came by and asked the underage girl to go on a Labor Day trip with him, and of course the older sister said no. So Clifford brandished a gun, shot her in the thigh, where she died a week later. They drove off after he shot her, and they ended up in Franklin, where they ended up coming across a woman with her son, Edna, who was waiting for somebody. She was held at gunpoint, and once Clifford took control of her vehicle and made her and the son go with him. At some point, he stopped at a desolate road where he dragged Edna to the bushes where he raped her and shot her. After this, Clifford pistol whipped her son and threw him out of the car. He survived, Edna did not. So at this point, even the FBI was on this guy, and they actually tracked both of them down in New Orleans. They didn't resist, and both were sent to Ohio to face charges. On July 2nd, 1948, Gales was executed in the Ohio Penitentiary's electric chair. Leroy Keith. Not much is known about Leroy, other than that he was born around the year 1907. But in 1934, Keith approached 52-year-old mill worker Fred Geist in his car when he demanded Geist to step out of it. Once Geist did as he was told, Keith shot him in the heart, killing him instantly. Police arrested Keith's accomplice in a planned robbery of a store, which needed a getaway car. His accomplice ratted him out and Keith was arrested. Keith was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. However, his death sentence was overruled and just received a life punishment. Keith was known to be a dangerous inmate who attacked other inmates. Somehow, Keith was eventually released in 1956, without consulting with the judge who had sentenced him to death in the first place. Keith had been doing odd jobs when he began robbing again with 2 other ex-convicts, but they were unsuccessful. They found 40-year-old Coburn Von Gutten coming back from an office party. Coburn refused to lend his car to the trio, and Keith shot him twice, but Coburn managed to start his car where he was shot a 3rd time. A patrol car drove by and exchanged gunfire with Keith, but he and one of his convicts escaped. One was captured, and Coburn was sent to the hospital where he died. A month later, police were looking for Keith and staked out places he might be. Police witnessed Keith, another man, and 2 women get into the taxi of David Suro. The police followed the taxi while the 2 men pulled their pistols out and said, "This is a stick-up." Suro saw the police behind him and crashed into them. Keith and the man got out of the car. Keith, on his way out, shot Suro twice. Keith exchanged fire at the police, who later cornered him. He was shot 5 times in the chest, but survived. David Suro unfortunately did not and died the next day. Leroy Keith was put to death by electrocution in 1959. Jarvis Coteau. Known as the DC Strangler, Jarvis Coteau was born on October 6, 1905 in South Carolina, raped and murdered at least 9 women. Not a whole lot of information about his early life, other than that he was the son of a preacher, which makes sense in South Carolina. The police knew about him due to multiple arrests for traffic violations and exposing himself in public. His MO was to impersonate as a handyman, and once he was alone with them, raped and strangled them. Coteau was questioned of the murders and he confessed, but later recanted his confession. He was subsequently arrested and executed via the electric chair. Robert Nixon. Robert was born in the small town of Tallulah in northern Louisiana in 1919. Not a whole lot is known about his childhood, but one can imagine life for a black man deep within Louisiana during Jim Crow. Nixon relocated to California, where he survived petty and auto theft. Nixon started his violent spree in 1937, where he began to assault multiple women with a brick, all of whom described a skinny black man as the one who attacked them. Nixon would become a murderer when, on March 2nd, he broke into the home of 20-year-old Rose Valdez. Valdez was a young mother when Nixon decided to rape and kill her while her baby slept in the other room. Almost exactly a month later, Nixon broke into the home of 48-year-old Edna Worden. While Worden and her 12-year-old daughter were inside, Nixon sexually assaulted both women and bludgeoned them to death with a brick, with mortar still attached to it. Police obviously started looking for a brick-wielding black man as the primary suspect. With all the heat on the capture of the culprit, Nixon hitched his way to Chicago. Unfortunately, in May of 1938, Nixon and another man he met while in LA, Earl, broke into an apartment where Nixon solely murdered Florence Johnson with her sister while they were asleep in an adjacent room. The sister woke up and spotted two men leaving. Both Nixon and Hicks were arrested because Nixon had blood on his clothes. Both blamed the other for the killing. Nixon left fingerprints, and with that exact MO, as the Los Angeles murders, police matched his prints with that of the crimes that were in LA. Earl Hicks was sentenced to 14 years in prison and was released afterwards. Robert Nixon was sentenced to death and executed by the electric chair. Ray Gardner. Ray Gardner was born in Ohio in 1922, and this dude's criminal record spans over 500 crimes. Anyways, he was raised in an orphanage because his parents both had a life of crime. In 1941, Ray was in North Dakota State Prison, and this was like his 5th or 6th time something in prison. He strangled his cellmate, and the doctors thought it was of natural causes, so Ray was never charged. So anyways, Ray was let out around 4 years later, and in 1949, he had struck again with a 17-year-old girl named Shirley, who thought she was going to a babysitting job. However, Ray had picked her up. He then took her to a gulch and proposed. She said no. Ray proceeded to grape her and kill her. Not long after this, he ended up in Montana, where he would answer an ad of a woman who was searching for a job. When Ray picked her up, and he tried to take her money, but she refused, and slapped him and attempted to run away, but unfortunately, Ray shot her and she died. He wasn't suspected for the murders until about a month later, when, like most criminals, this guy drove through a stop sign and hit the back of a trailer, so he was arrested, and they found the stolen items of the individuals on him. So, of course, he was tried and convicted, where he was charged with killing the woman who thought she was going to a babysitting job. However, they had a lot more evidence for the other crimes, so he had a choice of firing squad or electric chair. He chose the firing squad and died in 1951. Philip Coleman. Philip was born in 1919 in Illinois and had a multitude of half-siblings. At the age of 9, he was picked up by juvenile authorities for stealing bread. He was picked up that same day by his mother, and he would continuously keep running away. Sometime during his teenage years, he married a native woman who he would have 2 children with. However, they divorced shortly after for some reason. In 1943, a gentleman named Pearson hired Philip for work at a railway. While at the job, Philip became friends with another guy named Lewis. Well, one day after work, they went to a bar where they drank and played dice. Philip told Lewis that he wanted to rob Pearson, and when Lewis showed no interest, Philip immediately drew a knife and cut his hand. Of course, forced him to come to Pearson's house. But all he did was need Luis as a pawn. So, outside of Pearson's house, Philip called out for Pearson and told him Luis needed aspirin. When Pearson was coming back to them, Philip drew an axe and bludgeoned him to death. The 2 men then entered the residence of this and found his wife, who was sleeping inside. They threatened her to figure out where the money was, and she told them where they was at. But then Philip pulled out a knife and stabbed her to death. While Philip was getting the money, Luis went outside and hid behind rocks until he saw Philip leave with the bags of money. Once it was safe, he headed back out to town with a cut hand. Philip, on the other hand, was eventually caught up in the next town over. During his confession, he had said that he had in fact killed Miss Pearson, but not Mr. Pearson. Obviously, this wouldn't make any sense because Mr. Pearson was found outside and she was found inside. Nonetheless, this is one of history's fastest capital punishment cases because it only took 47 days from the murder itself to the execution. He was hanged in the Missoula County Jail on September 10, 1943. William Hearns. William was born in 1928 in Illinois. His family grew up poor and his parents would argue consistently. He would wander the streets. At the age of 13, he was arrested for having a loaded stolen gun. The police searched his home and found a bunch of stolen weapons in a shed. He had committed 11 robberies at this point and was sent to a school for wayward boys. He was released at the age of 16. This is where things got a little crazy. Around the age of 17, he would break into a 43-year-old woman's home and stab her to death multiple times. However, she made so much noise, he couldn't steal anything and he just left. Near the end of the same year, he would do the same thing to another woman. She was discovered with a knife lodged in her neck and a bullet wound to the head in her apartment. However, at the scene of the crime, he left on the wall written in lipstick, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." In January of the following year, he would kidnap a 6-year-old from her family and attempt to hold her for ransom and make money. Acting on an anonymous tip, police discovered the child's head in a sewer a block near her home. There were 4 or 5 different people who were arrested for these crimes because the police at first thought they were looking for a woman. Ironically, his story ends kind of how it started. In 1946, 17-year-old William was arrested for a burglary. The moment he was forever stuck in jail, when he was picked up at the final burglary. He was unconscious. A medical team was attempting to wake him up. While doing this, he consistently mentioned murders and thieveries, so not ever completely giving up the information, this had the police trace back some crimes and eventually he was convicted of all 3. He died in prison in 2012 at the age of 83. William Archard. William was born on May 5, 1912. He at least killed 3 people between 1956 and 1966 through the use of insulin. Archard had an interest in medicine, but his criminal background kept him from succeeding. He worked in a mental hospital between 1940 and 1941. He was charged and sent to San Quintino prison due to his possession of morphine. He was eventually paroled in 1953. William was married 7 times, 2 of which would be his victims. William killed his 4th wife, Zella, only after 2 months of marriage in 1956, his nephew, Bernie, in 1961, and his 7th wife, Mary, in 1966, all due from insulin. It would be the latter's death that would get him arrested in 1967. William is also suspected of killing his 5th wife, Junita, in 1958 as well, although this was never proven. William was sentenced to death in 1968, but California abolished the death penalty, which spared his life. He died in prison from pneumonia in 1977, leaving only death behind. Carol Cole. Carol was born on May 9, 1938 in Iowa. Carol strangled to death at least 15 women and drowned 1 boy between the years of 1947 and 1980 in 3 different states. Carol's father was fighting during World War II, while his mother had several affairs with different men while he was away. His mother often brought Carol to her arrangements and threatened to beat him if he told his father, although his mother did verbally abuse him and dress him as a girl because she always wanted Carol to be one. Carol also hated his name because it was a girl's name. He committed his first murder at the age of 8 when he would drown one of his bullies in a lake, which was ruled as accidental. In his teens, he committed petty crimes like minor theft and public drunkenness. He later joined the army but was dishonorably discharged for stealing firearms. In 1960, Carol ambushed a couple having sex in their car in a local lover's lane. Carol started his killing spree in 1971 when he started to strangle women, a fantasy he had been having for a long time. By 1980, he had strangled 15 women but confessed to killing as many as 34. Carol was caught in 1981 in Texas. He He was sentenced to life in prison, but more charges followed in Nevada he unwillingly agreed to be charged for. He was sentenced to death and was executed in 1985 from lethal injection. Marie No. Born Marie Liddy on August 23, 1928 in Philadelphia, she had many siblings and had contracted scarlet fever at the age of 5. At 15, she dropped out of school to work and take care of her niece, who was raised as a sister due to being a bastard child. Marie would later meet her husband and they eloped in 1948. The couple had 10 children and each one of them died shortly after their birth throughout the 1950s and 60s. One died 5 days after they were born. In 1963, Life magazine published a sympathetic article after losing her children. Almost 40 years later, in 1998, police went to investigate further after an investigative article about No's losses were published, questioning the circumstances of her children's death. The police interviewed her. She admitted smothering 4 of her kids, but said she did not remember how she killed the others. It was proven that 2 of her kids did die from natural causes and was not a murder. No pleaded guilty to 8 counts of second-degree murder. With the plea agreement, No had to have mental evaluation, which concluded she had narcissistic, paranoia, and antisocial tendencies. Wow. She received no jail time, only 20 years probation, with the first 5 being in house arrest. She died in 2016. Harvey Carnigan. Harvey was an illegitimate child, born in Fargo, North Dakota, in 1927. Harvey's parents entered a romantic relationship which resulted in Harvey. His father later abandoned him and his mother at the age of 5. While Harvey was growing up, he developed a sexual attraction towards his mother. Harvey was a bedwetter and was frequently sexually abused by other women at a young age. Harvey enlisted in the Army and was stationed in Anchorage, Alaska in 1949. In July that same year, Harvey attempted to rape 50-year-old Laura Showalter. In the process, he accidentally killed her. A man witnessed the struggle but assumed it was a couple having sex. The witness backtracked the next day and saw Showalter dead. Harvey was caught the next day but was eventually released. Harvey committed petty crimes and was arrested numerous times throughout the years, until 1972, 19-year-old Leslie Brock was found dead on the side of the road. Her head had been smashed by multiple blows and she had been raped. Harvey would post wanted ads for work in the papers, where he gets his moniker, the Want Ad Killer. 15-year-old Kathy Miller saw one of his ads, and when she met with Harvey, he killed her in the same way he did Brock. Her body was found in an Indian reservation. In 1974, Harvey was living with 29-year-old Eileen Hunley in Minnesota. She disappeared, and 5 weeks later, her body was found with her head smashed and a tree branch inserted into her. On September 20th, 1974, 18-year-old Catherine Schultz disappeared and her body was found in a cornfield with her head shattered. Harvey was arrested 4 days later. Harvey claimed that God told him to kill these women. However, that did not go well in court and was sent to prison, where he is actually alive to this day, to the current age of 95. Alright everyone, I just recorded the very end of the video and I'm pretty much finished. This took me, no joke, probably about, 50 hours to do in total, from writing to the very end. Any extra videos that I used of gameplay will be in the description. If you made it to the very end of the video, just leave a comment down below saying, hey, I watched it all the way through, and you said to leave a comment that I watched it, so I watched it. If you guys would like more of this stuff, please let me know. It was very, very fun to make. Just kind of gets you in a little place to reading hundreds of different serial killers. So thank you guys so much for watching, and please check out my other videos if you enjoy this one. I have other horror content as well. I'll see you guys later. Peace.